Meeting number 16 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, conformément à l'article 108 alinéa 2 du
According to Section 108.2 of the regulation, the motion passed by the committee on October 22nd, 2020, the committee will reprise its study of vulnerabilities created and exacerbated by the pandemic.
Urge all participants to mute their microphones when they're not speaking and direct comments through the chair. When you have 30 seconds remaining in your questioning or testimony time, I will signal you with this yellow piece of paper. Interpretation services are available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screens. Maintenant, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à nos témoins.
I would now like to welcome our witnesses, Mr. Guillaume Landry, Executive Director, International Bureau for Children's Rights,
Founder and Executive Director of War Child Canada, and Anu George Ganjana Topil, Executive Director of International Justice Mission Canada. Monsieur Landry, je vous passerai la parole pour 5 minutes de remarques.
Mr. Landry, 5 minutes for opening statements. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to go quickly because I have so many things to say, and I'm going to try to build on what the colleagues have already said in previous sessions. I would like to talk about the changing relationship of children with justice given the pandemic in a crisis, national catastrophe situation. We've been seeing this since the beginning of the pandemic. The relationship of children with justice is changing. We can think that there are new rules and regulation in place, martial law, curfews, restrictions that concern the lives of children. There are some schools that are closing, children that are left to their own devices because their parents need to work more, need to go further, need to fight, perhaps. There are all types of other aspects, for example, recruiting of defense and security forces, if we think of the Sahel. And many countries have seen a massive increase of their police and military personnel. They're being deployed in the streets, and they observe and they surveil the population. There is much more interaction between children and this personnel because children are not in school necessarily, and these interactions are becoming the new normal. The pressures on families make it so that the situation, the socio-economic situation, is deteriorating. And for many, the fine line between crime and normality is changing, and many children find themselves in conflict with the law for really many different reasons. We also have to take into account technology here as well as in the most poor countries and where there are armed conflicts. Cell phones are omnipresent. Technology is omnipresent. Children are confronted with these tools and opportunities, but oftentimes with a lot of directives or guidance, and we see a lot of child trafficking, sexual exploitation through technology in a context where we can seize the opportunity offered by these increasing interactions between children and technology, and also a reduction of supervision by parents, by schools, or others. With regards to screen time, for example. And another thing we've observed is that for frontline interventionists, for example, social workers, justice workers, security forces, we can think about work inspectors, people in charge of civil society. As you know, they have a lot of reduction in their numbers and their ability to deploy, their ability to offer preventative and curative services. That means that most children have a social security net that is wearing down. They're left to their own devices. They're left to themselves. And we've seen in many countries, and here as well, we have more cases of sexual and abuse cases linked to the pandemic. And this phenomenon is worldwide. This concerns all countries touched by this reality where the family bubble has closed, and if children's networks used to allow them to have services, and now we see a reduction in the access to these services and an increase of the pressure experienced by parents, and this can exacerbate domestic violence, violence against children, and sexual violence, more specifically. So the entire situation exposes these children, and I would like to talk about restricting freedom. This is also an opportunity. So if someone is not free of their movement, 7 million children in the world all of a sudden were in preventative detention. They were migrants. They were detained in orphanages without being able to leave. And so all of a sudden they become detained children, children who are stuck in procedural issues with the police without being accused. And there's an increasing number of children that are in this situation. The pandemic has made that oftentimes to protect the staff, there was a unanimous exploration. If we think about Sudan, Palestine, 85% of children that were detained were set free because they were scared of infection. So all this legalization created opportunities, but at the same time, what we see curfews, strict measures that are being imposed so that children are in conflict with the law. The systems are not ready for this, and so people are being put in prison a lot. So there's a lot of movements around it.
Next, we have Dr. Samantha Nutt for 5 minutes of opening remarks. Please, the floor is yours.
Oui, merci de me donner l'occasion.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Without a doubt, this is an uncertain and difficult time for children and youth everywhere, but especially for those living with poverty and armed conflict.
Health specialist, I've spent a quarter century now engaged in developing and implementing humanitarian programs in support of the world's most vulnerable children, especially in my capacity as president of War Child Canada. And so my testimony today is derived from direct information from our programs that span Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, reaching an average of 600,000 children and their families each year, and which are created and managed by our teams of more than 450 staff worldwide, 90% of whom come from the communities they serve. And certainly what I can tell you based on our experience over the past year is that communities within fragile states are currently facing an unprecedented challenge when it comes to protecting the world's most vulnerable children, which Mr. Landry has mentioned as well. And this is a reality that deepens the longer this pandemic plays out. In fact, the COVID pandemic for children living with armed conflict unfortunately threatens to wipe out much of the progress that we have seen in recent decades. And these threats can be abated, but only if there is sufficient public goodwill as well as concerted political action. Aujourd'hui, je vais me concentrer sur quatre.
Today, I want to focus on 4 priority concerns. First, children's education.
Children and youth here at home are feeling the harmful effects of lockdown measures when it comes to their mental health, physical security, and academic performance. Mais les enfants vivant avec la guerre.
But children living with war were already facing colossal disruptions to their education, sometimes for years, due to violence and displacement.
In response to COVID, alongside rising social and political instability in several regions in which War Child is currently operating, have only compounded this hardship. Girls in particular are especially vulnerable as families face income declines and can no longer afford the cost of tuition, for example, or because they are too frequently pulled from their studies to tend to childcare and domestic work. The longer children in such contexts are out of school, the bigger the gap in their education. And the bigger the gap in their education, the less likely it is that they will ever return. This also puts girls especially at increased risk of early and forced marriage. Les enfants et les jeunes qui ne sont pas scolarisés.
Children and youth who are not in school are also at much greater risk of being abducted or recruited by armed groups, being trafficked, and of experiencing sexual and gender-based violence.
Disruptions right now is a stark lack of infrastructure to support remote or distance-based learning in low-income countries more generally, but war zones quite specifically. UNICEF estimates that a third of school children worldwide cannot be reached by broadcast or internet-based remote learning. Global Affairs Canada has been supporting our organization's efforts in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo to reach 500,000 out-of-school children through the development of radio-based education programming. These efforts are ongoing. They are quite successful. However, there is an overwhelming urgency to expand such opportunities to neighboring regions to ensure children who are living with war or as refugees are not further burdened by generational poverty as a lasting consequence of such disruptions to their education. To address this, governments must start planning now, today, to work with local and international organizations engaged in education to expand distance-based learning and to build out catch-up, often called accelerated learning opportunities, which should begin as conditions allow. This is particularly critical for secondary school youth who are living with war, where the gaps are historically the most pronounced and where the runway for getting them back onto an educational pathway is usually the shortest. La deuxième est la sécurité alimentaire.
The second is food security. In brief, food is getting harder to access and less affordable for communities living with war.
Up shipping costs and made it difficult for farmers, especially subsistence farmers, to obtain the inputs needed to plant and get goods to market, resulting in a growing dependency on food aid. By late 2020, the pandemic had already added an estimated 120 million to the already 135 million people experiencing a food crisis in 2019. Within the areas in which War Child is working, the risk of severe malnutrition and famine is growing exponentially. The third pressing issue, and I'll be very brief about this, is the lack of government and health infrastructure in many countries embroiled in conflict, which many of you know about already. 70 low-income countries are unlikely to achieve majority vaccination coverage rates until 2023 or 2024. And this is no secret, and the underlying cause is no mystery. Nous pouvons faire plus dans les semaines et les mois.
We can do more in the months to come, and we should.
Very, very briefly, because I'm almost out of time here, concerns the enabling environment fostered by the pandemic in which rogue regimes, armed groups, and anti-democratic violence, for example, in Ethiopia and Darfur offer two such examples with devastating human rights abuses occurring against civilians. En terminant, je voudrais affirmer ma ferme conviction.
I would like to assert my firm belief that the challenges I've outlined here today are not, for the most part, insurmountable.
Armed violence, children and youth living with war need more than high visibility, short-term interventions. They need integrated programs that protect their rights and shape their futures through education, access to healthcare, the rule of law, food security, and economic opportunity. The pandemic has made realizing these goals more complicated, but it has certainly rendered them no less achievable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nutt. And now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Kanjana Topil. Welcome to the committee. The floor is yours for 5 minutes of introductory remarks.
Greetings. Namaste. My name is Anu George Kanjanatopal, and I'm the Executive Director of IJAM Canada. We are the world's largest anti-human trafficking organization, and we believe that we can end slavery in our lifetime. We are present in all regions where the most vulnerable population are, and my testimony comes from that experience. I want you to picture a woman, a mother with a baby in her sari, like me, caught in the midst of a lockdown, just trying to get home. She died of hunger and thirst on the train platform. The media was flooded with painful images of a hungry child tugging at her sari to wake his dead mother, trying to drink milk off this dead woman's breast. Makes me ask whatever happened to that baby or the millions of children who are more vulnerable now more than ever. She was just one of the 14 million people displaced in India because of the pandemic. The phenomenon of reverse migration has left millions of poor, vulnerable people stranded, exposed to extreme violence and a life that makes death feel like a relief. Online child sexual exploitation tripled from 400,000 to 1.2 million in 2020 in the Philippines alone. 65% of that time, it's a relative forcing these children to commit sexual acts. This is in sharp contrast.
If you'll excuse me for 30 seconds, would you be able to, just for interpretation purposes, would you be able to move up your microphone just a tad to take it out of the airflow that comes out of your mouth? It'll reduce the perfect. That'll be better for interpretation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for gifting me an additional 2 minutes. Yes, online child sexual exploitation tripled from 400,000 to 1.2 million in 2020. In the Philippines alone, 65% of the time is a relative forcing these children to commit sex. This is in sharp contrast to the notion that we are safer at home. There were more than 56 million children out of school in just one country in South Asia. Of those, more than 10.1 million are child laborers. Globally, child marriages witnessed a spike during the pandemic, resulting in 13 million more girls forced into early marriages. This evokes a pertinent question: are our children safe? We should care because we may have been responsible for this. 2020 changed many things, but not the way we consume goods. Consumption has in fact increased. The products we consume continue to be made by those enslaved and trafficked. It is our irresponsibility that has contributed to getting people into this vicious cycle. Therefore, our responsibility to respond. Our privilege is what causes us to think that as long as education is provided, jobs are there, drinking wells are there, poverty is addressed. However, if a child or women are raped on the way to school or the well, or a father is working as a slave to provide one meal a day for his family, then we have found a serious lacuna in what we believe was a solution in addressing poverty. Communities need food, water, education, but before poverty in these communities can be addressed, the violence must be dealt with. IJM is focused in addressing that gap. We do this by rescuing victims, bring criminals to justice, restore survivors, strengthen justice systems, and end violence by ending impunity. There are 3 regions I want to talk about today: Latin America, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. All these regions have targeted the Canadian government as allies in the pursuit of the advancement of international development. The feminist agenda is meant to elevate the rights and privileges of women throughout the world. For women to be elevated to an equal place in the society, economic empowerment is needed. And that's what the Canadian government has fought and continues to fight to accomplish. However, true economic empowerment cannot happen amidst a context of rampant violence. The story of the woman in the beginning is a clear example of that. Global Affairs Canada is a crucial player in the pursuit to protect women and children from violence in Northern Triangle. Canada can help fund a tech consortium which will scale protection through innovative approaches. They can help Guatemala fund a gold standard of trauma-informed services for the healing and restoration of victims of violence. Andean countries have identified Canada and GAC as a stakeholder in making the protection of women and children a priority in their countries. 7 out of 10 women and girls are victims of violence in Bolivia. There is an opportunity right there for us to impact change. Southeast Asia, the area oftentimes referred to as a manufacturing corridor, is largely powered by migrant workers and their children who are under extreme exposure to violence, trafficking, and slavery, all of which has been exacerbated by COVID-19. With Canada's investment, we believe that we can produce an intervention model to end slavery in supply chain in these areas. This alone has the potential to provide protection for 70 million people, all because of Canada's commitment to freedom. Finally, that leaves us with South Asia. As you know, India is a valued trading partner and is a strong economic force. Canada's proposed supply chain legislation, the End Modern Slavery Act, will require higher scrutiny for companies importing goods into Canada. By investing in initiatives to partner with the government of India to protect its citizens, children from violence, we can dramatically mitigate these potential negative effects. The act would actually do what it says: end modern-day slavery. As a survivor of violence myself, I have committed my work to the theory of change because I've seen it work. It is what motivated me to lead the rescue of 10,000 people. But I've had a second motivation as well: fear. Fear of not having anyone show up. Fear that always lies with the victim, so often women and children, and never with the perpetrator. I'm not a powerful influencer, just another one of those women who fall into the statistics of being a victim of violence once. But you, each one of you, everyone sitting here, has the capacity to make history at a time like this, at a time where everyone takes comfort in looking inward and trying to protect themselves, their community, their country. You've been willing to use your influence to impact change. You have the power to no longer allow violence to happen unchecked, to no longer tolerate it. As a nation and as people, imagine what that could mean to the lives of those languishing in violence and slavery and hopelessness. So what will you do so that we don't have to see pictures of a precious baby boy orphaned because of the effects of violence on his now dead mother? Namaste.
Thank you so much to our witnesses for their powerful opening remarks. We will now go into our first round of questions, and they will consist of 6-minute segments each. The first of them goes to Mr. Genuis. The floor is yours.
Thank you to all the witnesses. I want to focus my questions on Ms. Kanjan Thopil. Thank you so much for your powerful testimony. And I just want to say to others that those who are interested in learning more about this connection between injustice and poverty, there's an excellent book written by the founder of IJM called The Locust Effect. And I know we have very limited time in these hearings, but I would encourage those watching and other members of the committee to make note of that book, The Locust Effect. There's obviously many more stories and much more that can be said in a book length than we can hear in 5 minutes. I wanted to ask you two questions, both of which you touched on to start off. Anyways, the first is, how would you compare Canada's existing laws around supply chains to other models that exist around the world? What countries should we be looking to that have good, effective models of trying to advance human rights through the management of their supply chains? My second question is about fighting online sexual exploitation. There are, of course, likely cases of victims in the developing world and perpetrators in Canada. And that's a new phenomenon that we can counter. So what can we do to better represent the rights of victims who are not Canadians in our justice system, and do more to ensure we are prosecuting perpetrators in Canada, even if the victims have a limited voice within our system because of where they're located?
Absolutely. Thank you for these questions. To begin with, Canada is the only country in the amongst the G8 which is not effectively positioned legislation that can impact change in addressing modern day slavery. So that is the first place that we can start looking into things. Yes, the bill, we are in the process of working through that. But even if that bill comes into play, until and unless there is a specific way that we can impact how the goods are produced in developing countries, like I mentioned, the Southeast Asia, the manufacturing corridors, if we are not able to impact that, we are going to continue to ensure that we are contributing to the global slavery index. In response to your second question, the online sexual exploitation cases, as I mentioned, has tripled, and that is a very conservative number, to be honest, because we are basing it on the number of reports that have come in. But several perpetrators are from Canada. Several perpetrators. We have in fact been able to work in partnership with the RCMP here to identify one perpetrator whose sentence was increased. But what makes it possible for them to continue to do it? Because it is in the dark web. It is in silence. Nobody knows what you're able to do at a time like this, and you know that you're not going to be tracked back. If there are, say, 1 million perpetrators out there, we might be lucky if we manage to get to a point where you can arrest a few. And that is why the partnership IJM has with the Philippines government, the National Security Force there, and with the RCMP here is so crucial to increasing the addressing the crime and making sure that there is a deterrence, that people think twice before going online and purchasing sex from a child who's 5 months old for $5.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me try to get a couple quick questions in the time I have left. We've had some discussion in Parliament around the company MindGeek that runs Pornhub and the featuring of child pornography on their site, and some Canadian victims have been speaking out. I wonder if you could speak to the accountability of companies like that and internet service providers and others. What role is there for them and for the government in pressuring them to shut these things down? And then also, I wonder if you could speak about what kinds of aid spending can advance justice. If the government were to say, we're going to set aside a certain amount of money to specifically deal with justice issues, how could that money be spent most effectively? Absolutely.
As far as corporations who have been taking responsibility for their act, we saw an unprecedented shift in Australia, where a financial institution was caught for being the channel where people could purchase sex from children online. And then they committed to a few $1 million to making sure that they would reverse the bad effects of the channel which actually promoted online sexual exploitation of children. But the same can be applied with every corporation. I mean, it doesn't take too much for a financial institution to understand that, a few dollars like this at regular basis, it's going to a certain channel. It doesn't take much for anybody to investigate and get to the root of tracking where this money is going and why is it been spent in such small amounts, and the irregularity of the time or the regularity of the options that are available using these channels. But that's financial space. There are several other ways that corporations can step up and respond. In interest of time, to respond to your other question, what is the kind of investment? IGM hopes to protect 500 million people by 2030. It is working. It is possible. We started with a goal of rescuing 1,000. We have gotten there. We have rescued thousands. We know that it is possible to get there, rescue 500 million people if there is an investment of $700 million. To put it simply, $3.30, $3.30 Canadian dollars is what it takes to identify, rescue, restore a victim, and therefore lead to the bigger number of protecting a few millions more. So if we were to protect 500 million people, the investment is $700 million globally. But,
thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. That's your time. Monsieur Landry, j'ai vu votre main. C'est à la discrétion.
Mr. Landry, it's at the discretion of the MPs. Hopefully we'll come back to you.
To give the floor to Mr. Fonseca for the next 6-minute round, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our three witnesses for your testimony and for giving this very powerful insight, as the chair had mentioned. I want to begin my questioning with Dr. Nutt. Dr. Nutt, on War Child has been adapting programming in accordance with local programming. And are you able to provide us with an update and or expand on what has become of your radio-based distance education program, which you mentioned in your testimony, or the distribution of dignity kits to women? So that's my first question, because we've heard about this radio-based type programming. You mentioned it in the Congo. Can you do a deep dive and take us through that and how that works, and let us know how it's working out for your organization?
Yes, and thank you for that important question. So we started engaging in using the basic technology of radio, actually modeled after FAAE that started in Saskatchewan in the 1950s. And so we looked at areas where children were having difficulty accessing school and where a lot of girls in the Eastern Congo in particular were being held back from school because of high rates of sexual and based violence. So families were not allowing their girls to go to school because they became very concerned that they would be attacked along the way. And that presented a number of issues for those girls in terms of their access to education, but also the increased likelihood that they would then find themselves in early or forced marriage because they were considered to be a burden on the family and not actually physically in school. So with initial seed funding from the Wellspring Foundation, we looked at using radio as a technology where we recorded in conjunction with a lot of Congolese actors and various other teachers and personalities to record these on basically radio-based educational sessions, and we deployed teaching assistants to those communities. So where the girls couldn't go to school, school then came to them. And it wasn't limited only to girls' participation, because if you're deploying a teaching aid to a community and piping in the lesson, you want all children who need to be able to access school to be able to use those lessons. And so we started at the secondary school level, and we found that within 18 months, we had higher matriculation rates, so higher graduation rates at the appropriate grade level than the national average. We were seeing about 85 to 90% of girls who were then successful as a result of that. So that was the pilot program, involved a few thousand kids, and then with more recently with support from the government of Canada through GAC, we have been able to expand that to focus in conjunction with the Congolese government, not only on areas that are now affected by violence where kids were being held back from school, but not able because of restrictions. So we're about into that now, and we're seeing some very good results. There are a few constraints. Obviously, now we can no longer deploy, or it's a bit more complicated for us to deploy the teaching assistants because of public health measures that need to be in place. But where we're not able to accomplish that, we've offset it through other means. For example, by having access to telephone and that kind of thing. But we're seeing extremely good results. We're also working in Uganda to implement a very similar kind of program. And what makes it unique is not just that it's easy for kids to access, it's also at a higher level of education. It goes beyond primary, but includes secondary. As for the hygiene kits, I mean, this continues to happen. We're using that a lot and making sure that families have access to what they need, whether it's soap or other essential supplies in places like Sudan, South Sudan, and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's great. Sounds like this is working through the pandemic, and it may be the way forward for distance learning. So I want to ask you a question in regards to, it was reported, and you mentioned today about 90% or 90 plus. In 2018, it was 98% of your staff throughout the world were local to the region where programs were being carried out. So what are the advantages of working primarily with local partners for your program implementation?
And thank you again for that question. I mean, we have always done that. We have always prioritized. In fact, that is why we exist. We exist to try to decolonize aid and aid approaches in the sense that we work with local partners. They design the programs, they run the programs, and implement the programs. And we have either local or regional actors at all levels of our organization, but including at the country director level. They are the ones who are implementing those efforts, which means that during the COVID pandemic, we have been, I think, somewhat more resilient in terms of our approaches, our field approaches, because we have strong, robust local networks, and those programs have been able to continue. Whereas organizations that have a large reliance on an external expatriate infrastructure obviously have seen some of their activities curtailed as a result of the pandemic. So we believe very strongly that the best kind of humanitarian efforts actually invest in local capacity and make it possible for those communities to then rebuild and to do it on their own terms and with the priorities that they've identified. And our focus is always education, access to justice, and economic development, and they're the ones who are driving that. And I think, again, it speaks to how Canada runs its aid programs. If we want to move the dial forward, we have to move beyond short-term, short-sighted interventions, and we have to think about the structural challenges that children are facing in these contexts and have a long-term view of the problems of war and poverty and abuse and exploitation, and commit for longer periods of time to see that kind of transformational change realized.
Thank you. Question for Ms. Kanjana Thopiel. On October 29th, 2020, Bill S-216, an act to enact the Modern Slavery Act and to amend customs tariff, was introduced in the Senate. I know it's something you've backed. Why is it important that Bill S-216 or legislation like it become law in Canada?
And just a brief answer, please, in the interest of time.
Because decisions like that impact decisions in developing countries.
Well, that's a quick answer. So, and what gaps in the Canadian legal framework would this bill address?
The fact that we are not able to scrutinize how these products get into our country makes it a law without teeth. Makes it something that does not, in the larger scheme of things, benefit those who are in in developing countries, which actually makes products for us to benefit from.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonseca. Monsieur Bergeron, la parole maintenant est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. And thank you to our witnesses. Thank you very much for their precious contribution to the work of the committee. We rarely have the opportunity to hear a testimony in the French language, so thank you to Mrs. Nutt and Mr. Landry. Thank you for having given me that pleasure today. Since the beginning of our committee's work, we've been hearing many people say that the effects of the pandemic on studies or a school program this has had a huge impact on children in conflict zones. Mrs. Nutt was saying that children in conflict zones, in precarious zones, where life conditions are precarious, are used to disinterest with regards to school programs. But what we've been told is that this has been worsened by the effects of the pandemic. Many witnesses have told us that youth who are no longer at school are oftentimes going to work, or they are victims of trafficking or prostitution. We know that 2021 has been decreed as the year to eliminate child labor. It's quite ambitious by the UN. They hope to eradicate child labor by 2025. Do you think these objectives will be too ambitious and that we will have huge obstacles?
Alors, c'est à moi ou...
Is it myself or Mr. Landry? It doesn't matter. Mr. Landry, he has not spoken yet, so I will give him the floor. Thank you. Yes, the question is very important. As for child labor, it's interesting because in French is perhaps different.
En français, on parle de travail.
In French, we talk about work, and in English, we say work and labor. So labor is not something that's being prescribed, but it's the forms, the worst forms of child labor. This is being banned, and this is what we're working on this year, and we want to celebrate actions in order to eliminate child labor. This includes prostitution, sexual exploitation in all its forms, but also the use of children in armed conflicts, in mineral extraction, agriculture, chemical-based work, etc. So what we have to be careful about is that change is not something that happens quickly. If a school is closed, not 10 days later, the child is not necessarily stuck in a prostitution ring. No, what we see is that the options are slowly eroded, and all of a sudden, the child has the impression eventually that they're making a decision, and they are found in a climate of exploitation. And oftentimes the image that we have is that you have to kidnap a child to then constrain them to be in a situation. Not always, but if you're starting to shut down opportunities, to close doors, the children themselves have the feeling that they have taken the decision and they have had no choice. The basic principle is a child should not consent to their own exploitation. So in this sense, it's very important to look at the issue. And Canada adopted an act, an extraterritorial act, for years ago, but we don't really use it. So solutions should not be in the creation of new legislation, but to use existing legislation and to act. If you look at the RCMP cuts, we see that the deployment of police forces in embassies, we had a force that covered many countries, and now they're reduced. They have a reduced ability to do the surveillance of children trafficked in the tourism industry, for example. If we talk about Australia, we can see that it's a small percentage of Canadians that are found guilty for exploitation acts that they committed overseas, outside of Canada. So are Canadians better people than Australians? Well, you can debate that, but we can also see what's happening in the UK. For 15 years now, internet service providers and credit card companies have established means of cooperating that allow to trace and to observe activities on the internet. So we are only beginning this conversation. So there are very concrete models that would allow us to work in a much more solid fashion, to work with the private sector in order to eradicate these type of phenomenon. One last point, we have to highlight that most of the child exploitation labor situations is the first one is agriculture, and secondly, we cannot set aside the informal industry, the informal economy. This takes up a huge space in sexual exploitation of children. So the way that we are going to work with an heir, let's say you take a flight somewhere and that you sexually exploit a child. Well, this is no longer happening with the pandemic. Some people are renting apartments in a small community. So really, we're looking at exploitation in the smaller communities through the informal economy, and they are on the front line. They see that there's exploitation, but people there don't have the necessary resources to act, and we do have a responsibility. Well, you didn't leave me enough time to thank you, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
The final questioner in the first round, Ms. McPherson, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. This has been very, very interesting, very important testimony that we've heard. throughout this study, we have heard over and over again that the one of the big risks that we are looking at during COVID-19 is that we lose those gains, those development gains that we've made over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And we're certainly hearing that again today. Now, as the representative that goes at the end of our of asking questions, it appears to me that the best thing I could do to get information from our witnesses is to give you an opportunity to talk about maybe those one or two top things that you would like Canada to undertake. So this is a report that will be given to all parliamentarians. All parliamentarians will be able to access this. So I'm wondering if I could pass it to each of you in turn, and you could just talk about the one or two things that you think that the government of Canada needs to do, either in the short, medium, or long term, immediately, or what are the things that we need to do? What do we need to prioritize? And I'll start with you, Mr. Landry, if I could.
Sorry. And I feel I should give the floor now to Dr. Nutt, because she did that for me, and probably I would speak too much. So maybe I should take the last round then, maybe to be polite.
Very kind of you. Miss Nutt, please, or Dr. Nutt, please.
Fine, thank you. In terms of the top things that I would recommend, look, Canada's contributions to ODA have been basically stagnating for many years now, and we still are coming in at well under the target of 0.7% that is set by the United Nations. My bigger concern here is that as we go forward and endeavor to pay off the trillions of dollars in global debt that's been accrued as a result of the pandemic, and we're seeing this, many countries, including the United Kingdom, are already looking at cutting their official development assistance through that process to be able to make up some of those gains. I would say that one of the most important things Canada can do is to continue to buttress its ODA contributions, and to make sure that those contributions are really thinking very strategically about what kind of aid has the most impact. The kind of aid that has the most impact is locally driven, it is locally supported, it is longer term, it is targeting the structural challenges that exist within countries, including around education, access to justice, which we've heard a lot about today, economic development, especially for women. A lot of the issues we've been talking about, recruitment of young people into armed forces, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, all come down to a lack of protection infrastructure, a lack of justice, a lack of education, a lack of opportunity. If our aid dollars are being mobilized to go beyond short-term Band-Aid type solutions, and if we're thinking about education as part of a humanitarian infrastructure, not as something that happens after food, water, shelter, and blankets, but something that happens at the same time, because it's so critically important, because it augments children's vulnerability, then we're going to see that we're able to make a long-term difference in the lives of these kids. So I've taken enough time, and I want to pass the floor over, but that's what I would say is, let's not let aid be the first casualty of our deficit cutting when we get to that day, because it's really important.
Thank you so much for that, and I'll pass that over to Ms. Karjanthopoulos.
Thank you. I just have 3 points to share. I come from the field, and I've had to make decisions where we've had to choose not to go on a rescue operation for want of funds. And the area that IJM has been working in has been slavery, online child sexual exploitation, and other atrocities that are happening across the world. But at this point, I think the most important investment needs to be made in the space where we can directly address the problem of slavery by investing in the supply chain, making sure that all things that are, and that impacts Canada directly, making sure that we're investing in that space and identifying industries that force us into consuming things that we don't want to be buying from people. That is one place. The other place is the partnership. There is already limited partnership that we're having between these two governments, between Canada and Philippines. If there is an investment that is possible to make sure that we can increase the investigations capacity in Philippines specifically, because that is where the largest online sexual exploitation is happening. If we can invest there, if there can be a partnership there, these two things would probably lead to protecting 70 million people in the next 10 years. And I'm happy to provide with a plan if the committee would be willing to respond.
Thank you so much. Mr. Landry, it looks like you have 1 short minute left.
Merci. Donc, c'est vrai.
Thank you. So I think that stability in the support of the government is really important. I think that we see more than ever the importance of working on prevention, of building capacity, of being able to face crises, armed conflicts, natural disasters, pandemics. We need to build child protection systems that are able to withstand these issues and to respond, regardless of the nature of the issue. We have to move away from politically popular things, and we have to have stable support over the long term. I think these are the most important tools. And also, we need to de-bureaucratize processes. It's so long. There are very lengthy processes to obtain funding, so we have to deal with this.
Ms. McPherson, merci beaucoup. We will now go to our second round of questions, and the first speaker will be Mr. Diot for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I know that we've covered a lot of ground, and thanks to all the witnesses being here. It really is fascinating stuff and vitally important. Right now, of course, everybody is talking about vaccines and COVID. So I'm going to ask a fairly broad question that I'm wondering if it concerns you or any of you or all of you that following the failures of our own vaccine procurement, our federal government right now is ordering the COVAX vaccine that was meant primarily for developing countries. And I'll just leave it open to whoever wants to weigh in first on that.
I mean, I can go ahead.
Please go.
I don't mind speaking more in my capacity as a public health doctor on this front. I think that it's quite apart from sort of Canada's decision to execute its options through the COVAX program, which would provide us with additional vaccine supplies by the end of June, and hopefully, hopefully our own vaccine procurement will have accelerated before then, and we won't need those supplies, and we'll be able to ensure that countries that are actually still desperately holding out for additional support will be able to receive it. The bottom line here, though, is that we have now 70 low-income countries who are very unlikely to have access to vaccines in the foreseeable future. And the countries in which War Child is operating, we are looking at best a scenario where 1 out of every 10 people is vaccinated by the end of this year and possibly into early next year. And so what concerns me the most is what conversations are taking place to ensure that we do have a much more aggressive strategy around ensuring that particularly vulnerable high-risk communities have access to the vaccination, that vaccine is being deployed, that the capacity exists to be able to vaccinate. And I'm thinking very specifically around issues of migration and displacement. We are one of the few organizations very active on the border between Sudan and Ethiopia in response to the arrival of Tigrayan refugees that taking place over the last couple of months. And many tens of thousands of them are arriving. And the more that you have this kind of displacement, the more vulnerability, the more crowded conditions. You've got very few humanitarian organizations that are on the ground implementing there right now because of the constraints related to COVID. I mean, you are talking about an area, you are talking about parts of the world where that COVID could really become entrenched, where new variants can emerge, where that it is a threat to all of us. So my own position on this is that we understand as Canadians as much as anyone else right now what it feels like to watch other countries get vaccinated while our seniors face real consequences in long-term care homes. We I hope will not endeavor to do that to any other country on this earth, that we will be thoughtful and sensitive moving forward to this issue, and that we will recognize that it is in all of our best interests to ensure that the most vulnerable, and especially those living in impoverished, crowded conditions, are vaccinated as soon as humanly possible and have an equal stake and an equal share in that opportunity.
Excellent, yes, great answer. And would anybody else like to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. COVID kind of struck us at a time where we had to deal with something that was not our expertise, but it aligned with what we were doing, delivering things that needed to be delivered to those in vulnerable communities. We have partnered with nearly 340 organizations, institutions, NGOs, provided over 38,000 people with direct crisis relief due to COVID, provided emergency supplies, grocery, reached over 4 million people through awareness raising efforts about vulnerabilities from COVID-19, helped over 3,000 survivors receive ongoing aftercare services, implemented nearly 570 new violence response or mitigation efforts alongside our partners, provided over 358 cases of remote assistance to police and public justice officials, including provision of PPE, transport assistance and consultations, all of these things in just few districts. And I'm taking these numbers from memory of a particular state, but the need just increases with the vulnerability. It is important to note that we need to be able to respond to those who are in segments of the society, and it requires being aligned with the government, and that's what we have been doing thus far, making sure that they get the benefits that they deserve.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Diot. Next is Ms. Sachs, again for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses who have come today. This has been a really important discussion on so many of the aspects that feed into the safety or lack of safety of children in conflict areas and what's going on during COVID. I previously in my life before being an MP worked with organizations dealing with human trafficking, and particularly in relation to women and girls. And I do understand the realities and the complexities of trying to stop the human trafficking chain and also rescuing and rehabilitating victims of it. During the best of times, it's really challenging, and especially during a pandemic. So my first question is, during the pandemic, we know that children who are at home, but we also know that criminal networks are still out and about in these areas and involved in the work in what they're trying to achieve. So has the exploitation industry changed in the past year in terms of the pandemic? And how should we, our International Development Minister Gould committed $1.6 billion towards COVID response in January of this year, and should we be looking going forward to what aspect of we know there's a shadow pandemic of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation. What should we be considering in terms of adapting our approaches to the COVID response in relation to gender-based violence and human trafficking?
If I may specifically call out the example of how we started our work in certain countries. We started addressing sexual exploitation of minors. And this was in private homes, or this was in brothels. This was in places which were specifically designated for these. So we started by reducing violence in those places. And we succeeded. We were able to bring that down from 88% prevalence of minors being forced into prostitution. We were able to bring that down to 1.6%. But what we saw was that as the perpetrators realized that this investment was going in a different direction, they got creative. And that is how they moved to the online space. And now with the pandemic, we have seen that they have gotten more creative than ever. They have realized that there are different sites that they can explore and make sure that it makes it a lot more challenging to navigate and identify and rescue, or even get the perpetrator who is exploiting children this way. So we have relied heavily on technology to make sure that we are a step ahead of the perpetrators, to make sure that we can impact change. And rightly so, the investment in that space is so crucial, because now more than ever is where everyone is relying on this high bandwidth internet, which makes it so easy and so cheap to access, and plus the time, right? And the fact that everybody is working from home also makes it possible for them to have this as a side hustle in generating income and also exploiting children. So yes, there is a crucial investment. And what I think is important is also to be able to influence the space where the government can influence in ensuring that countries which are using certain websites, which very categorically invest and ensures that they're having online explicit content that is exploiting children. There are ways that we can halt those, like Pornhub, for instance. It took years before Pornhub and the issues around that was addressed. So I think now is the time to invest in that space and also address the problem.
Thank you for your answer. I'd like to move a little bit in a little bit different direction with this to talk about the victims. So the victims, women and children who are victims of human trafficking and this type of sexual exploitation, whether it's happening at home or through criminal networks, and talk about the challenges of addressing trauma and helping victims, especially in the COVID space that we're in now.
It is incredibly challenging. You bring a brilliant point. It's incredibly challenging because these are victims. Even if you're rescuing them, they are not able to get out of the victim mentality. They feel that, they don't deserve a life of freedom. So it is almost impossible not to have these conversations or take them to a childcare home where people are, dealing with the challenges of pandemic. So yes, that has been very, very difficult. But how we have been able to tackle this problem is that a lot of these initiatives are led by survivors who've been there, done that, having conversations with children who have been, rescued. But it is not easy. It has been an extremely difficult task for IJM to address this in the midst of the pandemic. But we have been creative. Is all I can say. Thank you.
Okay. It looks like the chair is signaling we're nearly out of time.
You have very little time left, but thank you, Ms. Sachs. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We will now go, Monsieur Bergeron, le tour est à vous pour 2 minutes et demie.
Mr. Bergeron, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would have liked to deal with the issue of people being let out of incarceration settings. My concern for Mr. Landry is to find out if these youth were, when they were set free, were they taken care of by the state, or were they simply did they find themselves in networks of sexual exploitation of minors? Mr. Landry won't like to hear me speak about Tigre. There are refugee camps, too, where there's no access to a high commissioner for refugees. What is your vision of this situation and the situation for children and women in this conflict? 2.5 minutes. Okay, so these are huge issues.
Diversion, hein, juste pour être clair. Donc, la déjudiciarisation, c'est certainement une opportunité, éviter que les enfants se retrouvent privés de leur liberté parce qu'ils sont dans un processus où ils n'ont rien à faire là et ce ne sera pas du tout une solution pour le traitement de leur cas. Donc, vraiment, la judiciarisation, l'incarcération devrait être une mesure de dernier recours.
Point of order. Sorry to interrupt, but I don't have translation.
Please. Okay, we will suspend for a minute and see if we can fix this. So diversion is an important, there's a lack of opportunities. Yes, if we saw in Indonesia, in Morocco, Burkina Faso, in Colombia, we saw countries where there were direct measures and a lot of children were set free to avoid that the prisons become places where contamination and infection were spread. But it's a risk. And so do you only set them free, leave them to themselves, and then they're exploited? So there's so many variations, but many organizations are working in order to accompany these processes and to make sure that the fact that these children are set free is just a step and it's not an end. So there's a lot of expertise that's been developed, and this morning there was a UNICEF webinar that was talking about lessons learned over the past 9 months for children's justice and what has been done. Now, quickly, as for Yemen and other countries and children that are found on the front lines without any access to humanitarian aid. This goes against many, many international laws. The situation is extremely concerning. All of their rights are potentially not respected, and there's no humanitarian assistance. Once again, these are the messages sent out by both my colleagues. How
how to work with the local people to reduce the risks. And so this is the value of prevention and local action.
Oui, Landry, merci. The final round this afternoon goes to Ms. McPherson again for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to all the witnesses. I wish I could take you all out for coffee. I have so many questions and I have such a short amount of time. But I do want to follow up on something that Mr. Landry just talked about, and that is Yemen. What would it mean to the children of Yemen if Canada stopped selling arms to Saudi Arabia? Like, what is the role that Canada can play in terms of taking our dollars out of that conflict? If you could comment on that.
It's a key question, not only a sale arm, but also the role in peace processes and the mediation that Canada has been able to play, for instance, in the Great Lakes, East Africa. And that role has been rather very discreet in the Middle East in recent years. So the complexity of that particular conflict and of this conflict and the involvement of so many external actors is certainly a key problem, and the reduction of the space for the UN to play its role in such a context is also quite critical. So yes, looking at arm trade, but looking also at pressure on Saudi Arabia, and looking at the pressure at the UN on the incapacity of the UN to take action in light of evidence that are very strong when it comes to violations that have been committed by countries that have lots of influence on the UN. So I think this is something that we need to be extremely careful about, and Canada could play a role in that sense.
And I see that the U.S. has paused those sales to Saudi Arabia, which is an excellent step. But I'm also wondering if you could comment on our contributions in terms of ODA, in terms of our development contributions to Yemen, and whether or not they are enough, I guess, at this point, considering the humanitarian crisis that we're facing there.
I suppose, in my opinion, the answer is sort of integrated in the questions. There's so much more that needs to be done. We need to look at Yemen also in the migration path of so many population from Eastern Africa that goes through Yemen to reach other places, and that vulnerability is key. So it is not only looking at the situation within Yemen, but having a regional perspective on things, and not only supporting multilateral organizations, which have been really benefiting from Canada's assistance, and that should continue, but probably diversifying the options and the support to civil society organizations who are by and far not on the top list of actors who are supported by Canada. So this would make a big difference, I think, looking at Djibouti, also Somalia, all of those are really connected. So not just having a country-to-country focus.
Excellent point. Thank you so much.
Ms. McPherson, thank you very much. Thank you, Monsieur Landry. And colleagues, this takes us to the end of our scheduled time with our witnesses this afternoon. On our collective behalf, I would like to thank all three of them for their testimony, for their expertise, and most importantly, for their extraordinary service around the world. We all feel that we would have liked to have much more time with you. Time is limited. I would like to just remind you of the option to our witnesses. If you have comments that you weren't able to make, the option is very much available to you to direct them in writing to the Office of the Clerk so that members of the committee can receive them and review them. I will now ask our panel to disembark the ship, and we have some committee business that we will continue once you've had a chance to disconnect. But once again, thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon, and we'll suspend for a couple of minutes.
Thank you very much.
Merci. Which is the notice of motion that was brought to us by Mr. Chung, and Mr. Chung would like to speak to his motion. We've allotted roughly 15 minutes. We've got some other business to do this afternoon in camera, so we will start with the discussion on the motion that Mr. Chung has brought. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the committee express its deep concern about material identified in UNRWA textbooks, which violates basic norms on human rights, tolerance, neutrality, and non-discrimination at a time when UNRWA is receiving funding from the Government of Canada, and report this motion to the House.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chung. Let's invite comments through the feature on Zoom, the raise your hand feature. I don't see anybody yet, but the floor is open for comments, discussion on this motion.
Sorry,
Mr. Oliphant. And colleagues, please just keep using the raise your hand feature. That way we have the chronology. Mr. Oliphant, Ms. McPherson.
So I am looking for my notes. So I just, this caught me by surprise. I thought this was happening later in the meeting. So I'm just a little bit off guard. I will tell you right now that I'm in support of the motion, but I have an amendment that I would like to make to it, and I just need to find that amendment. So I want to look for it. I'll find it online on my email. Just 1 minute, please. Sorry.
Mr. Chair, I have Mr. Oliphant's version in front of me.
Okay.
I'm happy to help. If it will save
in the spirit of
seconds.
collaboration and collegiality, Mr. Oliphant, if you're okay, we will ask Mr. Morantz to.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Mr. Oliphant proposes the following amendment. Correct me if it's changed since I received this, Mr. Oliphant, but I believe what you wanted was that the committee express its deep concern about certain educational materials circulated to students by UNRWA during the pandemic that violates the values of human rights, tolerance, neutrality, and non-discrimination at a time when UNRWA is receiving funding from the Government of Canada, and report this motion to the House. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morantz. We'll give the floor to Mr. Oliphant, please.
Yes, and I do believe that Heather may also have a sub-amendment to that as well. But let me just speak to this for a moment and say that the government, through the Minister of International Development, has expressed this concern, and I think it is appropriate for this committee to express it as well, and that I think that this is important. I think that Canadians expect the funds which are transferred to UNRWA to be used well, and I know there have been many undertakings to ensure that they are used well, and there are mistakes that happen from time to time, and that we need to acknowledge this problem, and I think that's what we're doing in this motion. So it's a slight rewording of it, and I think we would be very happy with it. And but I'm also open to a sub-amendment that we may have to deal with first. So I'll, as they say in the States, yield to Ms. McPherson at the chair's discretion.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Thank you. And yes, we'll go straight to Ms. McPherson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't know that's what they said in the States. So the amendment that I would like to include is the words "in error" into the amendment that's being proposed by Mr. Oliphant. I think that it was very, very clear that we were in unprecedented times, that there was an incredibly fast and challenging switch to online, to paper learning, to a number of different changes to the way that UNRWA was able to provide education in their work. And this slipped through, and it was very clear, and they've made a statement that is indicated that it was done in error and that it has been rectified. So I think it's important that that is articulated within this motion as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. I have Mr. Chung next.
Mr. Chair. I know we're on the sub-amendment, but I'll just say first that I support the amendment that was introduced by Mr. Oliphant, but I cannot support the sub-amendment moved by Madame McPherson. I think it stretches credulity to say that it was an error. So I personally won't be supporting the sub-amendment, but I will be supporting the amendment.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chung. I've got Mr. Genuis and then Mr. Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is an important motion, and I'm happy to support the amendment, as Mr. Chung has said. The implication of the sub-amendment being that this is kind of a one-off typo, something that's never happened before, just doesn't really reflect the realities of the legitimate and serious, long-standing concerns that have been there associated with UNRWA. There are different views and legitimate different views on how to respond to that, but it's not as if somebody just, you know, they accidentally mistranscribed something and the language appeared there, right? This is a question about material that was put in the textbook, not a typo or an accident. So I think the amendment for Mr. Oliphant reflects that reality. The sub-amendment does not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. I've got, I'm sorry, I might be out of sequence. Mr. Morantz, were you next?
Sure, I'm next. Okay. Just kidding.
And I've got Mr. Oliphant and Ms. McPherson also in line.
Sure, I'll go. I do support Mr. Oliphant's amendment. I don't support the sub-amendment. And the reason is, and I don't know if all of you have had a chance to go through the report that triggered this, but there's a January 2021 report from Impact on this. It's a 46-page report, and if you read it in its entirety, it's damning and indicative of a pattern of behavior, if you will, going back a number of years. But it is mostly focused on the current events, and so I think, given the comprehensive analysis in this report, it behooves us to take it at face value and have an appropriate debate on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morantz. Mr. Oliphant, Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do, believe that we should have debate, but it's very hard for me to debate something that I am not a part of. I have read what UNRWA has said with respect to this, and I simply have decided that I think we need to take that for what they say, so would be supportive of Ms. McPherson's amendment, and then continue to work with UNRWA to ensure it never happens again. That absolutely we want to ensure that there are appropriate educational materials, that we do not tolerate anti-Semitism in any fashion, and we expect all the materials that Canadian dollars are being spent on to uphold that as well. And I think that adding in error does not diminish that whatsoever. It simply acknowledges what UNRWA has told us. And I think that we need to keep pushing UNRWA always to ensure that they're doing their work in the way that we and our international partners want them to do it. But I don't think it serves anybody to not take them at their word for what they're saying. So that's why I will be in support of the sub-amendment and then the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to read a little bit from the statement that UNRWA had provided, because Mr. Morantz does bring up the point that we should take reports at face value. Well, the report that we were provided actually points out to the fact that some of this material had previously been identified already as not being in line with UN values and was mistakenly included. That as soon as the issue was identified, the agency conducted a thorough review of the entirety of the self-learning material that UNRWA developed and took steps to address it. And also that in order to ensure that all educational materials provided to students are those which have been approved by the agency as in line with the UN principles and values, the agency developed an innovative, secure, agency-wide self-learning platform which will contain all of the learning materials for UNRWA students. So currently in its final review process, this platform will be launched in coming days. So they are not only apologizing for the error, but they are clearly identifying that it is an error, but they are taking steps to ensure that that error doesn't happen again. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that and we recognize that.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. I've got a growing list now. I've got Mr. Morantz, Monsieur Bergeron, Ms. Sachs, and Dr. Fry.
You're on mute, Mr. Morantz.
Sorry, I was on mute. The age of Zoom. Thank you for that, Ms. McPherson. I do appreciate the argument, but I don't know if you've had a chance to go through in detail the 46-page impact report to see the magnitude of the essentially the offenses. And I could go through some of the points here, but it would take some time, and I don't know if the committee would allow that time. But I just want to, I think it's important when you look at the report as a whole, and as my colleague, Mr. Chong said, it really stretches credulity to say that this was an error. However, having said that, I would be willing to propose a friendly amendment to the sub-amendment. And I'll tell you what it is. I just have to find it. So instead of saying was an error, I would propose a friendly amendment which would say which UNRWA claims was an error. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Morans. Mr. Oliphant, Monsieur Bergeron, Ms. Sachs.
I can accept that. I don't want to split hairs on this. I want us to get on with it. I think the fact that they've claimed that it's an error, it is actually probably true that we can't be the judge and arbiter of that. It allows them to say that it was an error and allows the reader of this motion to accept the fact that it may or may have not been. I choose to believe that it was an error because I'm trying to work with UNRWA to make sure that they don't do this again. But I think that is a reasonable suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you. First of all, sorry for having lost you for a minute. I was a little bit late, so I reconnected to participate in this debate. I had the opportunity to note to Mr. Chong that I would support his motion, and I'm very pleased that there are amendments. But this being said, I simply want to say that I find it's unfortunate that we have this situation. Why? Well, for the simple reason that UNRWA admitted that they made a mistake. And, well, if we add on the statement made by the minister, I feel that this is overkill. It's overkill because we know that UNRWA plays a determining role for many refugees, Palestinian refugees that need support from this organization. And we know this because we worked on this in the scope of the committee, that the organization had important funding issues. And if we attack them repeatedly, we will only increase the financial problems that this organization might be facing. So you might say that a mistake was made, and it's not an insignificant error, and that we have to expect that an organization that receives public funding has to be accountable. And I do agree with that. And it reminds me also that as MPs, we are confronted to a similar situation. You've probably all received emails by organizations in civil society that complain that the Israeli consulate in Toronto promoted the enlisting into the Israeli army. And this goes against the Canadian Act that forbids enrolling Canadian citizens in foreign armed forces, or that foreign armed forces recruit on Canadian soil. The Israeli consulate in Toronto declared that this was a mistake. Well, okay. So we decided not to act. No, they said it was not really a mistake, but it was an ad targeting, I would say targeting exclusively Israeli citizens living in Canada and not Canadians, in order that they would enlist in the Israeli army. So as we if we listen to the Israeli consulate authorities, well, it doesn't serve anything to harp on this further, but I think that we are adding We are adding to a situation. It's an unfortunate situation. The minister already has publicly expressed a statement on behalf of the government of Canada, and UNRWA has admitted that this was a mistake, and mechanisms are now in place to avoid that this type of mistake will happen again. I think that's all. So I think it's unfortunate that we are in this situation today. This being said, I do recognize that my colleagues have the right to speak to the committee about this issue, and we're going to vote on this, and I'm telling you that I will support the amendment and the sub-amendment that was suggested. And if our colleague, Mrs. McPherson, accepts the friendly amendment that was made by Mr. Morans, I will also vote in favor of this proposal of a sub-amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
And Dr. Fry, just from a procedural perspective, there's no such thing as a friendly amendment, so we will have to deal with the amendment as it was introduced. But let's see where the conversation goes. I'd like to hear from the next two members, who are Ms. Sachs and Dr. Fry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. So I too have read the FAAE report in its entirety, and I think the amendment as it stands with the sub-amendments and the suggestions highlights really our intention. I agree with MP Oliphant, Parliamentary Secretary Oliphant on this, that, we do want to make it clear that we expect accountability. We do acknowledge that an error was made. We accept that UNRWA is taking responsibility for that error and knows that it needs to report back to us. I would like to say, as we go through this conversation, just to highlight to perhaps Mr. Morantz, that UNRWA does not produce textbooks, it produces supplementary materials. And the heart of the problem is really textbooks that circulate within the jurisdictions. And this is something that we have limited control of in the context of this room, of this committee. However, recognizing that, I do know that both the minister and those who are working on the investigation process, that we are diving deep into really the source of the problem so that we can encourage neutrality in the programs that we support on behalf of the children being educated and that are under the responsibility of UNRWA. I do agree with Mr. Bergeron that supporting refugees is critical. These are populations that are part of our role as a global citizen to support communities in crisis and in conflict, which UNRWA does serve. And in that role, we have an important place to play into ensuring that neutrality does stay. And if we don't continue with the funding that we have and we don't continue our partnerships to help support neutrality in the region, then, as an Israeli citizen myself, I can't express enough the need of having good partners on the ground who are supporting neutral culture and neutral practices from the education of children and right on through civil society. So I support both the amendments, and hopefully we can move forward with this.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sachs. Dr. Fry, and then Ms. McPherson.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to really repeat what everyone said. I agree with Rob Oliphant, and I agree with what Ms. Sachs has said, and I agree with what Stéphane Bergeron said. So I can support the sub-amendment, but I just think that we need to be very careful that we continue to support, as Ms. Sachs says, neutral people who are trying to help on the ground. It's really difficult when you have differing views and differing conflicts. And I think we could get around this and talk about the sub-amendment. I think you'd get full support for it. But I think we need to also try and remember how things really work in zones in which there is conflict, there is differing opinions, there is everything. And again, we cannot interfere with the sovereignty of a country that is writing its own textbooks. We're not writing those textbooks, and UNRWA is not. And I think UNRWA got a very, very strong a positive report. That report I read fully, and it was positive. It was strong. It talked about the integrity of the architecture, the vision. It talked about all of that. So I think we need to just say, we accept that it might have been a mistake, and let us move on now without trying to make this into a massive incident with, partisan overtones. Thanks.
Dr. Fry, thank you very much. Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm new to this, so I'm not sure if this is the right time, but I don't like this, the friendly, I guess, the non-friendly, friendly sub-amendment of Mr. Moran's. Unfortunately, I do feel like that is insulting to UNRWA, and that it is unnecessarily questioning their truthfulness, I guess. I do struggle with that. So I would not be supportive of that.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Just before we go to Mr. Genuis, procedurally, the two options that we have is to basically vote on Ms. McPherson's sub-amendment as she introduced it, which is the one that's formally before the committee, or through unanimous consent, agree to replace her sub-amendment with Mr. Morantz's, but that does require unanimous consent.
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair, on that to understand.
Please.
Can we have a sub-amendment? Like, could we? Because it sounded like Mr. Morantz was trying to amend the sub-amendment. Is that possible?
That is possible. He called it a friendly amendment, and just procedurally, that gets us onto turf that isn't in the rule book.
Yeah.
But a sub amendment is possible, and you have the floor with your intervention, Mr. Genuis.
Okay, I'm sure perhaps Mr. Morantz may wish to put up his hand and move the sub amendment, or he may not.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Sorry.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Just so we're all on the same page. My understanding is that you can't move a sub amendment.
Okay, let me just get the advice from the clerk on that.
Just so we're all on the same page here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You can only have one sub-amendment at a time.
Okay, I stand corrected. So again, the two options, unanimous consent to replace Mr. Morantz's, Ms. McPherson's sub-amendment with Mr. Morantz's, but it does require UC or a vote on the sub-amendment that Ms. McPherson proposed to the original motion.
Point of order then, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
So then I would say we don't have unanimous consent because Ms. McPherson has not given it. Therefore, we are not able to deal with that. So I would ask the chair to move us into a concluding debate on the amendment that Ms. McPherson did, and then we can go afterwards. It could be re-amended. It's just you can't nest too many sub-amendments. You can revisit, but you can't do that. So you can't. So point made. I think we just simply need to move on and go back to the amendment that Ms. McPherson made.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Is it the committee's will to return to the discussion on the amendment? I see Mr. Genuis has his hand up. Is it on that point?
I just have a very brief point. I don't want to hold this up. I agree with proceeding in that fashion. I just want to say we have to acknowledge that this is a very big deal. Like this is highly anti-Semitic material in educational materials that's being given to children in a conflict zone. You know, and I given the history, the idea that we would just take UNRWA's word for it, at the very least, you know, trust but verify, right? We know what they said and we can report what they said, and I think that's the best way to proceed. But it's just a mistake. I think that misses the real significance and gravity of the implications of putting material like this in front of children. I think we're all supportive of the idea of engagement with the Palestinian people. When I was in the territories, I visited an UNRWA school as well as a security lab that was funded by our previous government that facilitates security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. There are opportunities to support engagement, but this is a very serious issue. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. Can we then return to the discussion on Ms. McPherson's amendment? Are there any other points, or have we had a fulsome exchange of views to be able to vote on the amendment that she proposed?
Mr. Chair, I just sorry I didn't have my hand up. I'd be open. I'm not sure how we would do this procedurally because I haven't been around long enough. So I take your word that we can't have sub amendments, but maybe it might be the word claim that's an issue. So I'd be open, for example, to change it to say, you know, that UNRWA has stated was an error. Just as a matter of fact, I think that maybe the word claim could be interpreted to, I can see how Ms. McPherson would be concerned that the word claim would bring into question the veracity of UNRWA's statement. So I'm just wondering if the word stated was an error would be satisfactory.
If that generates, Mr. Rance, thank you for the idea. If that generates UC, then we could replace that language, basically replace her amendment with that language and proceed with a vote on that, but it would have to draw unanimous consent from the committee. Would you want to just read that one more time with the, and then we'll give Ms. McPherson a chance to respond in a minute, but just insert that into the entirety of the sub-amendment.
Speaking to me, Mr. Chair?
Sure, or whoever would be in a position to do that.
I would have proposed the insertion of the words, circulated to the students by UNRWA.
After the word pandemic.
After the word pandemic, which UNRWA has stated was an error. After the word pandemic, which UNRWA has stated was in error.
Okay, reaction from colleagues. Would that draw unanimous consent from the committee to basically take that language and replace Ms. McPherson's amendment with it? Ms. McPherson, did you want to come in on that?
Only that, I mean, I could live with it, but I would prefer my own, so I wouldn't give unanimous consent.
Okay, so then in that case, I would, just in the interest of time, colleagues, I don't want to rush this. I think this is an important issue and we had a fulsome exchange, but the next step procedurally would be to vote on Ms. McPherson's sub-amendment. And then there's always an opportunity to reinsert a further amendment after that. Would colleagues want to do this on division? Would you want a recorded vote on that? Or maybe do we have unanimous consent on the amendment after all?
Why don't you just call a show of thumbs?
Okay. That's all in favor? Straw poll. Any opposed? Okay, we have Madam Clerk, if we can just ask colleagues to hold thumbs up and down, we'll do a count.
On vote présentement sur l'amendement de Madame McPherson.
We're voting on Ms. McPherson's amendment.
I'll proceed to a recorded vote because that's what's indicated in the terms of the House motion.
Mr. Chair, I would like a recorded vote. This is too iffy or thummy or something.
Yes, let's go to a recorded vote.
Okay, so the recorded vote is on the sub-amendment of Ms. McPherson. Mr. Fonseca. Could you unmute and say yay or nay, please?
Yay.
Dr. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes, yay.
Ms. Sahota.
Yes.
Ms. Sachs.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
No.
Mr. Diot.
I vote no.
Mr. Genuis.
No.
Mr. Morantz.
No.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Ms. McPherson.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, the result is 7 yeas and 4 nays.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. The sub-amendment carries, and that takes us back to the main motion.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move a sub-amendment to the main motion.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. It doesn't carry us back to the main motion. It carries us back to the amendment.
My apologies. Yes, Mr. Chung. Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to propose a sub-amendment to the main motion that after the word pandemic, the words that UNRWA states was an error be added between the word pandemic and the word that.
Mr. Morantz, is it a sub-amendment to the main motion or to the amendment we just passed?
To the main motion.
Mr. Chair, point of order. That I believe would have to wait.
I might need some instruction from.
Sorry, to the.
The only thing we can amend now is the amendment I made as a sub-amendment. So yeah,
okay, so it's
it doesn't
to that.
Yeah. So you can amend my amendment, but I don't think that works. You would have to come back, and the chair would have to rule whether or not that was an acceptable sub-amendment after we had passed a discrete sub-amendment and an amendment. So that would be up to the chair's understanding of whether you could revisit it again. But I think right now we are having to debate my amendment as amended by Ms. McPherson and the committee. So I think that's where we're at.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Yes, and views on that.
Est-ce que je peux demander, Monsieur le Président, ce qu'on relit?
Would you please reread the amendment, please?
Or
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I do not. I was dealing with a technical issue when it was moved.
Okay.
So, Mr. Oliphant, maybe?
Sure.
Unfortunately, I still haven't had a chance to go back. I think Mr. Morant ironically has it.
Mr. Morant, please.
I
Yes.
would be happy to introduce Mr. Oliphant's amendment. It reads as follows: that the committee express its deep concern about certain educational material circulated to students by UNRWA during the pandemic that violates the values of human rights, tolerance, neutrality, and non-discrimination at a time when UNRWA is receiving funding from the Government of Canada, and report this motion to the House. I believe I have that right.
The only thing is it would have to, that's my amendment, but it's now been amended by Ms. McPherson. So it's exactly what that was, except in error has been added to it.
Et simplement
Does Ms. McPherson have the amended amendment from Oliphant? Can you read it for us?
I can give it a stab if that would be helpful.
Please go ahead, Ms. McPherson.
That the committee express its deep concern about certain educational materials circulated to students by UNRWA during the pandemic in error that violates the values of human rights, tolerance, neutrality, and non-discrimination at a time when UNRWA is receiving funding from the Government of Canada, and report this motion to the House.
Et simplement pour
For myself, my own information, what is the difference between that text and the main motion from Mr. Chong?
Motion for comparison?
Oui. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Motion.
In my motion, the amendment from Mr. Oliphant and also Mrs. McPherson together would replace in English the phrase
avec, en anglais, certain educational materials circulated to students by UNRWA during the pandemic in error that violates the values of.
Merci, Monsieur Chong.
Et maintenant, nous avons un sous-amendement.
And now there's a sub-amendment proposed by Marty Morant to add 4 words in English, which UNRWA claims was.
The words pandemic and in. So that's the current motion or, amendment, sub-amendment in front of the committee.
To the amendment. Mr. Chong, thank you. I think we've had extensive discussion on the arguments. Does anybody else want to come in and speak to the substance? Otherwise, I would, or to the procedure. Mr. Oliphant.
I just wanted to understand, I was trying to find it in writing. Are we back to claims or stated? In what Michael just read.
Sorry, stated.
Claims.
Stated.
Mr. Chung read claims. If we want
I read claims, but I believe Marty said stated. My mistake. Sorry.
Okay, and I will just say I can live with stated.
Okay.
If that helps us move somewhere on this.
Yes.
I think that that's fair. I think claims has a loaded nature to it, and stated is just putting it out there. So I think that could be something I could live with.
Good, good.
Do I detect an emerging consensus on this?
Yes, call the question.
Okay, all in favor of the amendment to the sub-amendment to the amendment proposed by Mr. Morantz? All in favor? We can do this maybe by quick show of thumbs. All in favor?
Agreed.
Anybody opposed? That seems to be unanimously carried. Thank you.
I have another amendment, however.
Mr. Oliphant.
And now we have an amended motion. I would like to strike the last few words of the motion about reporting this to the House. I think it can be a motion of this committee. The minister has already made as strong or stronger than this. And so I don't think this does value to our work by adding, taking it to the House. I think our committee is strong enough that we can do that. And I would now move that we strike and report this to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Oliphant has moved another sub-amendment striking the final words and report this to the House. Any discussion on this amendment? We have Mr. Chong, Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Chair, I don't support that. I think we should report this to the House. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chong. Mr. Fonseca?
Mr. Chair, just having heard that, I support this change, and the reason is, what I'm seeing here is really a political football that's being tossed around. I think we're addressing it here at committee, and respectfully to the members, I would say let's stop these games in terms of having this political football be tossed around. I think we all know where this is looking to go from. I'd say mostly from the Conservatives.
Mr. Fonseca, thank you. Dr. Fry, Mr. Diot, Ms. Sachs, and Mr. Chung.
I think I want to agree with Mr. Oliphant's amendment because I do believe that the minister has made a strong statement, which obviously is a government statement. I think we as a committee have now agreed we're going to put forward a motion amongst ourselves, and I think as Mr. Fonseca says, all this is seeking to do is to stir up a partisan thing in the House. And surely I think I've heard Mr. Bergeron say over and over that some of the things we deal with are far too important for us to play games with it. And I would actually agree to Mr. Oliphant's amendment to remove those letters.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. Mr. Diot?
Well, I think that if we're proud of our work as a committee, we want to involve the general public and as many Canadians as possible. So, of course, it should go to the House.
Don't even know what you're talking about.
Excuse me, I'm talking.
Order. Ms. Fry, you should apologize for that.
I think this was accidental, Mr. Genuous. She wasn't on mute. She now is. Mr. Diot, please continue.
Insulted my colleague and suggested he didn't know what she was talking about. That's
one person at a time, Ms. Fry, please. We work hard, and I think that committee work is very important. A lot of Canadians don't understand the good work that committees do. And if we're proud of this motion and we're all agreeing to it, why not spread it to as far and wide as we can? It's a no-brainer. So I say that we report it to the House. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Diot. Ms. Sachs?
I'm going to concur with my colleague, Mr. Oliphant, as well as Mr. Fonseca and Dr. Fry. To be frank, the minister on January 22nd stated clearly that she is deeply engaged in understanding what is going on and getting to the bottom of the issue, and is actively involved with counterparts in UNRWA and our other funding partners to address the situation. That is a public statement. It is being dealt with by the ministry and the minister and her team. And while we can debate this as much as you want, the public already knows that the government is engaged in this. It's very nice that the committee is taking the time to be involved in a very fulsome discussion about it. But as Mr. Bergeron said, why do we need to beat a dead horse here? It is already being addressed. We're in alignment on the importance of this, that it must be looked into, and that this committee stands in the strength of its convictions. It's already out in the public. It doesn't need more. It's already there. There's nothing to hide.
Sachs, thank you. Mr. Chung, Mr. Genuis, Mr. Oliphant, Dr. Fry, and Mr. Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I introduced the motion, and so I just want to address some comments that were made. I don't play games, and I don't do things to play games. I introduced this motion because I feel strongly about it, and that's the reason for which I introduced the motion. Now, I respect members who disagree with the substance of the motion, as Ms. McPherson has voiced her concerns about. I respect that position. But I'm not playing games here. It's an important issue. This is not the first time this has happened. Other countries have suspended their funding to UNRWA because of recent reports of wrongdoing that has taken place. I think of the Netherlands, I think of Switzerland. So this is not a trivial issue, nor is it one in which I am playing games. I believe that it's important for us to make a statement on it, and not just within the confines of this committee, which is why I think the chair ought to report this motion back to the House. The government, the executive branch, has clearly stated its position on it. It issued a statement on this. And I think as a co-equal branch of our system, we have a responsibility to voice our opinion on it. And one way we do that is not just by adopting the motion at committee and having it stop there, but by having the chair report it back to the House so that all of our colleagues officially on the record in Hansard will know what the position of this committee is. So I think that it should be reported to the House, but I respect those colleagues who don't want to do that. But let's not cast aspersions as to why any member is voting one way or the other on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Mr. Genuis, Mr. Oliphant, Dr. Fry, and Mr. Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I mean, respectfully to all, a few people have mentioned that the minister has issued a statement on that. I just don't know what that has to do with the question of this amendment, which is when a committee comes to a conclusion, do they just decide that among themselves and leave it there? Or do we do what is our function, which is coming to conclusions which we then report to the rest of our colleagues? We were tasked as the Foreign Affairs Committee with focusing in on particular issues, developing expertise in them, and then reporting those conclusions to the House. Now, why would we, on issues dealing with the Good Friday Accords, on issues dealing with any number of other things, why would we choose to report those matters to the House? And then on a case dealing with UNRWA, where there seems to be actually, at least based on what people are saying, substantial agreement on the concern, why would we decide in that case not to report it to the House? If it's an important issue, which I think it is, and if the government has something to say on the issue, which by all indication they do, if it's something we want our colleagues to take note of, then of course we should do our job, which is report this to and inform the House. And colleagues, if we choose not to, I think it communicates to the public something about the seriousness with which we take this issue. Given that we have chosen in every case in the past when we've adopted motions like this to adopt it to the House, why would we? Pardon me, to present it to the House. Why would we not do that in this particular case? I think that would raise big and legitimate questions. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. In sequence, Mr. Oliphant, Dr. Fry, and Mr. Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make a couple of points on this, and in no way do I think I am trying to make this a silent or a private motion. This is a motion that will be passed by committee, and all motions that are passed by our committee are in the public realm. This will be a public statement from this committee. I would agree with Mr. Genuis in that the reality is if we do a study if we engage and have witnesses and do that full work of a study, we should report it to the House. That is not this case. This is us making a statement as parliamentarians. All of our colleagues can find out about it. If we wanted to, we can send it to them. There's no reason why the chair can't make this a wider distribution of a motion. It is the reporting back to the House and having a House debate on this issue, which I don't think will be helpful. I don't think it is helpful in the Canadian realm. It is not helpful in a pandemic time. It does not strengthen our relationship. It does not build the structures for peace in the Middle East that we are trying to do. And that is why I don't think it should go to the House as a report from us. I don't think we've done that kind of work on this. And I think that we can, it will be a public motion. There's no way that this is quiet. It is there. It is something this committee has stated, and that is our responsibility as members. We could do it as individuals. And frankly, if someone in the House wants to raise this issue, they have the right to have a motion. They have the right to have all kinds of other ways that this can be raised in the House. I am saying that the work of this committee is not furthered by us reporting it to the House. So I think it is better for us to leave it here and monitor the situation. And if there is a repeated problem, we should do a study, and we should address it there in a thorough way. But that's not what we've done today.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. I've got Dr. Fry and Mr. Morantz.
Thank you, Chair. I reiterate what Mr. Oliphant said, but this is of a different nature. I wanted to apologize to Mr. Diot. I thought my microphone was on mute, Kerry, and I honed in on what you were speaking. I didn't really mean to do that, so I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Chair, I think my points were made by Mr. Chong and Mr. Janis, and so I'll withdraw my hand.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, mindful of time, but also don't want to short circuit a discussion. I think, again, we had a fulsome exchange on this procedural, on this sub-amendment. Are colleagues ready to vote on Mr. Oliphant's sub-amendment? And Madam Clerk, perhaps we should also do a recorded vote on this just for precision and clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So all those in favor say yay, all those opposed say nay. Mr. Fonseca.
Yay.
Dr. Fry.
Yay.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yay.
Mr. Hoda.
Yay.
Ms. Sachs.
Yay.
Mr. Chong.
Nay.
Mr. Diot.
Nay.
Mr. Genuis.
Nay.
Mr. Morantz.
Nay.
Monsieur Bergeron. J'ai rien entendu, Monsieur Bergeron.
Pardonnez-moi,
I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Merci. Ms. McPherson.
Yay.
Mr. Chair, that is 7 in favor and
7 pour, 4 contre. Merci, Madame la greffière. Alors, le sous-amendement est adopté. Cela nous amène à la motion principale de M. Chong. Débat sur la motion telle qu'amendée. Est-ce qu'on veut adopter la motion avec dissidence? Ou est-ce que vous voulez un vote par...
No thoughts? Anybody opposed to passing it on division?
I'd like to have a recorded vote.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chong. Okay.
It's not clear who supported it and who didn't. Okay. I want to indicate my support.
Madam Clerk, we will we'll go to a recorded vote on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the main motion as amended. Mr. Fonseca.
So as amended by Mr. Oliphant?
Correct.
Okay. Yes. Yay.
Dr. Fry.
Yay.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yay.
Ms. Sahota.
Yay.
Ms. Sachs.
Yay.
Mr. Chong,
Yay.
Mr. Diot,
Yes.
Mr. Genuis,
Yes.
Mr. Morantz,
Yay.
Monsieur Bergeron,
Oui.
Ms. McPherson.
Yay.
Mr. Chair, that is 11 in favor.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. The motion passes. Colleagues, that takes us to the end of that discussion point. We are going to reconnect in camera. I'm very mindful of the time. We are going to have to do a hard stop at 6:15. That gives us, minus connection time, about 45 minutes to make progress on the interim report. So there is a link in your original email that has the login for the in-camera portion. I encourage all of us to quickly connect, and we'll resume the discussion then.
you.